Hello everyone, how are you? Long time no see. Today I'm back with this animation tutorial. To create this project, I took these old cartoons as my inspiration. I wanted to create a curving, stylized motion for the cone, while for the scoop of ice cream, I took claymation as my inspiration. So I guess this is a bit of a hybrid, and I combined several animation techniques to get this result. While I created a plasticine looking shader for my final animation, I did experiment with a rubber hose look, so maybe I'll use it for a future project. Let me know in the comments if you'd like me to make a video on how to create this look. Okay, let's begin. Let's click outside the screen, and I'm gonna hide the timeline for now to have a bit more room. I'm gonna show the transform panel for you to see it, and let's select the default cube and Ctrl 2 to add a subdivision modifier. Go to edit mode, and for beginners out there, there are a few keys you'll see me pressing pretty frequently. So first, the numbers 1, 2 or 3, these are the shortcuts for switching between vertex, edge and face selection mode, so pay attention to which one is enabled right here. Another shortcut that's gonna be useful is Alt-Z to enable and disable X-ray mode. So pay attention to that as well, since I won't be saying which mode I'm in all the time to avoid repeating myself too much. And then of course, the usual navigation hotkeys. Okay, so activate face selection mode by pressing 3 like I said, and select this bottom face right here and scale it down a bit. Now select the top face and I to inset face and E to extrude down on the Z axis, and scale down a bit. Alt to select this loop of faces, scale and press Shift Z to scale on the X and on the Y axis only. Let's go back to this bottom face and scale it down a bit. Like I said at the beginning, Alt-Z to enable X-ray mode, and Alt to select this face loop that's on the inside, and scale down. To create the top part of this cone, go back to Object Mode and apply the Subdivision modifier. I'm gonna add a Subdivision modifier to keep my model smooth, and since we applied that first Subdivision modifier, if we go back to Edit Mode, we have more geometry to work with. Select this loop of faces right here and Shift to add this face loop to the selection as well. Here I already have my scoop of ice cream, but we're gonna create it in a second. E to extrude along the Z-axis, and Shift Alt to add this face loop to the selection. As you can see, I have all these faces selected, and now right-click and extrude along normals. Select this face loop and Shift Z to move down on the Z-axis. Ctrl R to add a loop cut and escape to place it right in the middle. Scale on both the X and on the Y axis to make this part a bit rounder. Now I'm gonna select this top face loop and move down. And again, scale on the Y and on the X axis. And move down again. Now select this edge loop, double shift to slide it down. I'm gonna disable overlays to see a bit better, and scale on the Y and on the X axis until the mesh looks smoother. Select this edge loop and move down on the Z axis. Now select this edge loop, scale it up and move down on the Z axis. Let's scale it again. Move down and scale up until this edge loop is closer to the next one. Now select this edge loop, I'm gonna disable overlays to see a bit better and scale it down a bit. Let's go back to Object Mode, and here we have our cone. Before we continue, Ctrl S to save this project. I'm gonna create a new folder and let's name our file. And hit save. To create the scoop of ice cream, add a UV sphere, move it up to place it and scale up. I'm gonna move it down a bit and shade smooth. Ctrl 1 to add a subdivision modifier and set this value to 1. To create the whipped cream, on top, add another UV sphere, go to Edit Mode, move up on the Z-axis and scale down a bit. Now select this bottom vertex and with proportional editing enabled, move up on the Z-axis. If you can't see the radius, you might need to decrease it with the page down key. Select this edge loop and scale down. Let's decrease the influence until you get a shape like this one. Now select all these vertices, remember to be in X-ray mode for this, disable proportional editing and move down a bit on the Z-axis. Now select all these vertices and again move down, enable proportional editing again and select this vertex right here and move it down on the Z-axis. Move it a bit to the side and I'm gonna do the same with this other vertex to give this mesh a more organic, imperfect shape. Now select all these vertices, disable proportional editing and move down on the Z-axis. Select this edge loop, enable proportional editing and scale down a bit. Let's decrease the influence. Select this middle vertex and move up on the Z-axis. Increase the influence a bit and X to delete this vertex. Select this edge loop, F3 to get the search menu and look up for grid fill. Now select this middle vertex and move up on the Z-axis. Rotate. Move to the side, rotate again, and move a bit. We definitely need a bit more geometry in some places to keep touching the shape up. So Ctrl R to add a loop cut, escape, and let's add 3 cuts. And add another loop cut right here, escape, and again Ctrl R and escape. Back to object mode, Ctrl 2 to add a subdivision modifier and shade smooth. Move it down and before we rotate it, let's escape, we need to set the origin to geometry. And now it's easier to move. I actually ended up placing this mesh to the right, so later I'm gonna move it. Scale on the Z-axis, but press the Z key 2 times. And move down, press Z 2 times here as well. Now back to edit mode, I want to refine this shape. So select this edge loop and scale up a bit. Let's see it in object mode. There are some harsh lines I want to get rid of, so back to edit mode. Select this edge loop and scale a bit. Let's see. Okay, now I'm gonna set my object into place. Like I said, I ended up moving it towards the right. And I'm working in front view since I haven't placed my camera yet, but I'm gonna place it similar to this view. There are still some lines here, so select this edge loop, disable proportional editing and scale a tiny bit. I need to scale it a bit more. I think it looks okay and I believe this will be a good moment to save your file. Now we can go back to the scoop of ice cream. Go to edit mode and to create the mouth we're gonna add some geometry around this vertex. K for the knife tool. And I'm gonna create all these cuts around this vertex. And enter to confirm. This one is not going to be the cleanest topology to create a mouth, by the way. And now delete this vertex. Let's increase the number of subdivisions so the mesh looks a bit smoother. Now select this bottom vertex and move up on the Z-axis. Move this top vertex down. Select these 2 vertices and move up on the Z-axis. Let's select all these 4 vertices, extrude, escape, and move on the Y-axis towards the inside. Scale down, extrude on the Y-axis, and scale. And F to fill. And here we have more or less a mouth. To create the tongue, select these 2 faces, Shift D to duplicate, escape and search separate selection. Go to object mode to select this new object and back to edit mode, A to select all and E to extrude. A and scale down a bit. Let's move it down. And now select this vertex and move it a bit on the Y-axis. Now select this vertex at the back and move it on the Y-axis. And now select all these vertices. And move on the Y-axis. Select this edge and move it up on the Z-axis. And now select all these edges. And scale down. Move this middle edge up a bit. A to select all and scale down on the Z-axis. Rotate on the X-axis and move down a bit. Scale on the X-axis and back to object mode. Let's continue with the scoop of ice cream. Scale these two vertices on the X-axis and move this bottom vertex on the Z-axis. And finally, I'm gonna scale the tongue up a bit more and origin to geometry. To create the teeth, Shift S and cursor to selected. And now we can add a cube right here where the tongue is. Add a subdivision modifier and shade smooth. In edit mode, scale down and move up a bit. Let's scale it down a bit more and move on the Y-axis towards the front. Ctrl R to add a loop cut and escape. Add another loop cut and escape. Select all and scale down on the Y-axis. Scale down on the X-axis and scale on the Z-axis. Let's move it up a bit, and I think the tooth should be a bit more inside the mouth. Shift D to duplicate, escape and move on the X-axis. A to select all and move them to the center. I want the teeth to be a bit rounder, so let's select all these edges. And Ctrl V to bevel. Let's add a couple more segments and change the width. And now I'm gonna select these two middle edges and move down on the Z-axis. And here we have our mouth. Now we can set the cursor back to the word origin. Let's increase the subdivisions so it looks a bit smoother. Now it's time to create the eyes. Add a UV sphere and in edit mode, move it up and scale down. Let's place the sphere. And rotate 90 degrees on the X-axis. Scale on the Y-axis and move on the Y-axis towards the front. Let's move it down a bit. And now rotate the eye until it's close to our scoop of ice cream. Back to object mode, shade smooth. Shift D to duplicate, escape and back to edit mode, scale this mesh up. Scale down on the Y-axis and move behind our first sphere. Let's rotate a bit more until our mesh looks correctly placed. And back to object mode, add a mirror modifier for each sphere. And now select both meshes, and before we scale them down, set the origin to geometry, and now set the scoop of ice cream as our mirror object. And let's scale both objects up a bit. I'm gonna move the eyes a bit more. And to create the cheeks, select the pupils, Shift D and escape. Move down and scale down. Move towards the front and scale a bit more. Let's finish placing the cheeks. Rotate like we did to place the eyes. Now it's time to create the sprinkles. Select this mesh, Shift S and cursor to selected. Add a cylinder and set the vertices to 7. In edit mode, scale down. Move it up. Scale down a bit more and scale on the Z-axis. Let's scale it down a bit more and rotate it and place it. I think it's a big bit, so let's scale it down. And let's place it. Now Shift D and Escape to create another sprinkle, and let's place it. And now again Shift D and Escape to create another one, and I'm gonna place this one at the bottom to create some visual balance. Now in Object Mode we can add a subdivision modifier. Let's set it to 1, and for this one I chose Shade Auto Smooth. Back to Edit Mode, first I'm gonna move one of the sprinkles. Since we have several meshes here, hit double A to deselect all, to make sure we don't select any vertex by mistake, and now place the cursor in the sprinkle you want to move and press L to select this mesh only. I'm gonna rotate it a bit and move it. I'm also gonna add the loop cut and escape, and I'm gonna do the same with the other two sprinkles to change their shape a bit. I'm gonna increase the subdivision modifier, and to have another shape of sprinkles, let's add a UV sphere with 10 segments. And in Edit Mode, scale it down and place it. Let's scale it a bit more. Rotate it if you like and place it. Scale a bit on the x-axis. And now duplicate. Let's move it. Duplicate one more time. And I want one more. This one could go to the side. And let's tweak the spheres a bit. Let's check how things look in front view. And I want to move some sprinkles around until I feel like the composition is balanced. And here I went back and forward between the cylinders and the spheres until I was happy with the placement of both shapes. And maybe we could add one more sphere at the top. Add a subdivision modifier and shade smooth. Okay, now it's time to place the camera. To place the camera real quick, select it, choose your view and press Ctrl-Alt-0. And now we can make some minor adjustments. Now it's time to animate the ice cream. First, I'm gonna take the 3D cursor to this bottom vertex, Shift S, cursor to selected, and back to object mode, let's add an armature. And here we have it. Let's go to edit mode, A to select all, and if you scale it, it gets scaled towards all sides. I'm gonna escape. So we need to change the pivot point to individual origins, and now it scales from the bottom. And subdivide it. I chose 4 subdivisions. A to select all, and I'm gonna scale it up a bit more. To create that wiggly movement, we need to go to pose mode. First, I want to see the names of each bone, and as you can see, all the names are in descending order except for the bottom one. So just to be organized, let's change the name of that bone. I'm gonna name it bone 005. To set up the armature, select this bone and add a damped track constraint. Set our armature as the target and pick the bone that comes after the one we've selected. In my case, it's bone 003. And now let's repeat the process. Select this bone, add a damped track constraint, set our armature as the target and pick bone 002. And one more time. Damped track constraint, armature, bone 001. Let's select this bottom bone to test the armature. It's not working yet, so let's reset the position and back to pose position. And what we need to do is set the influence for each of the green bones. Here let's go with 0.2. For this one I chose 0.4. And for this one I went with 0.8. Let's test it again. Move it to the side, and it seems to be working fine. Escape. Let's reset the position, and now we can parent the armature to our model. First, hide the camera and delete this default light. A to select all, Shift and click the armature. So now everything is selected, but the armature has a different color, meaning it's the active object. Ctrl P and parent with automatic weights. And now we can test our armature in pose mode. And it's working. Let's escape and reset. I'm gonna bring the timeline back. Now the thing is, this armature controls the whole model, so we still need something to control the scoop of ice cream only. Set the 3D cursor to this bottom vertex, Shift S, cursor to selected and back to object mode, add an empty. Hide the cone and the armature. And again, A to select all, Shift, select the empty, Ctrl P and parent object. Alt H to bring back all our hidden objects, and let's test our empty. Seems to be working, so let's animate it. Go to camera view and in frame 40 set a location keyframe for the Z axis. And here in frame 29, move it up on the Z axis until it's out of the frame. And set a keyframe. Okay, now let's animate our armature. In pose mode, select this bottom bone, where it's still in frame 29 by the way, and set a location keyframe for the X-axis. In frame 1, move on the X-axis to the left and set a keyframe. And here's our animation for now. It looks a bit wonky, but if you take a look at the cone alone, the animation seems fine. I want to exaggerate the movement a bit, so first let's move this keyframe to frame 33, and I'm gonna move to the right a bit on the X-axis to make the movement a bit more noticeable and set a keyframe. Now we're gonna move this bone to create some sort of overshoot effect. In frame 29, set a rotation keyframe for all these values. And in frame 34, rotate to the right a bit and set a keyframe. In frame 40, duplicate the first keyframe, the one with the values set at 0. Let's see. It's looking fine, but I want a bit more bounce, so let's go back to frame 34 and rotate the bone more to the right. Replace these keyframes, let's see. And now duplicate this last keyframe to frame 46. And here in frame 40 we're actually gonna rotate towards the left and replace these keyframes. Let's see. Again, let's duplicate the last keyframe and take it to frame 52. And here rotate towards the right, but not as much as we rotated the last time, so the velocity decelerates gradually. And I think we got it. Let's go over each keyframe so you can check your work out. These are my values for bone 004, frame 29, the rotation values are set at default, frame 34, Here we rotated the bond to the right. Frame 40 we rotated to the left. Frame 46 rotated to the right just a bit, and in frame 52 back to default. Okay, now let's take a look at bone 005. Keyframe in frame 1, the object is set to the left, outside the frame, and in frame 33 the cone is in the middle of the frame. Let's show everything again and back to object mode. If you take a look, the scoop of ice cream acts out when the cone is moving, and we don't want that. We want the scoop to appear from the top after the cone stops moving. So first, I'm gonna move the empties keyframes to frame 46. The second keyframe is in frame 57, by the way. On the first keyframe, set a scale keyframe, and one frame before, scale to 0 and set a scale keyframe. Let's set the camera sparse back 2 to 1 to get a cleaner look, and let's see. And it's looking alright. Okay, let's set this one back to 0.5, and now let's animate the sprinkles and the whipped cream. So in frame 57, let's set a location keyframe for the Z-axis for these three objects. And in frame 46, which is when the scoop of ice cream appears, let's move these three up on the Z-axis. And now I'm gonna move the cylinders up. Now I'm gonna move the UV spheres only and set a keyframe for the three meshes. Let's take a look. Okay, I would like them to appear even more gradually, so let's go back to our first keyframe. And I'm gonna move the three objects up way more. Let's move this up a bit more. Now move the spheres only. I'm gonna move this to a bit more, and of course this was a trial and error process until I got it right. Set a keyframe, and here I forgot to set a keyframe for the cream, but since I'll go back to this animation later to refine it, it didn't make any difference. Okay, now to animate the scoop of ice cream with a stretch effect, let's add a lattice modifier. Let's scale it up and place it where we have our scoop of ice cream. Make sure the scoop of ice cream is in the middle of the lattice object, and here we have it. I'm gonna set the resolution to 5. And duplicate it since we're gonna use another lattice object later, and hide this one for now. Back to this one, we need to parent it to the empty, so Ctrl P and parent object. So now the lattice object moves along with the empty. Okay, let's see. Go to frame 53. First, we need to add a lattice modifier for the scoop of ice cream. Set the object. Now let's take the lattice object to edit mode, and in X-ray mode, select all these vertices and move up on the Z-axis. Scale it just a tiny bit, and as you can see, now our mesh is deformed. So now we can animate it. So back to the scoop of ice cream in frame 53, set a keyframe for the strength in the lattice modifier, and in frame 57, take the strength to 0 and set a keyframe. And in frame 50, also take the strength to 0 and set a keyframe. Let's see. Now of course what we need to do is to make all these objects deform as well. So let's remember the keyframes and the values real quick. Okay, let's start by adding a lattice modifier to all these objects. Let's begin with the eyes pupils. Choose the lattice object, set the strain to 0, and in frame 57, set a keyframe. Go to frame 53, take the strain to 1, and set a keyframe. And in frame 50, take the strain to 0 again, and add a keyframe. And now the pupils are animated as well. Okay, now repeat the process with the eyes. Add a lattice modifier, choose the lattice object, frame 57, strain to 0, set a keyframe, frame 50, set a keyframe, and frame 53, strain to 1 and set a keyframe. And repeat, but this time with the cheeks. Add a lattice modifier, choose the object, frame 57, take the strain to 0, set a keyframe, frame 50, set a keyframe, and frame 53, take the strain to 1 and set a keyframe. And let's go back to frame 57. Now select the tongue, add a lattice modifier, choose the object, take the strain to 0, set a keyframe, go to frame 50, set a keyframe, and frame 53, take the strain to 1 and set a keyframe. And let's go back to frame 57. And repeat with the teeth this time. Add a lattice modifier, choose the object, take the strain to 0, set a keyframe, frame 50, set a keyframe, and frame 53, take the strain to 1 and set a keyframe. Let's take a look. It looks fine, but the cream is being covered, so select these 3 objects and move their keyframes to frame 53. And I'm gonna move the cream a bit and set a keyframe. Now I'm gonna move the sprinkles keyframes to frame 56. Let's see. And I actually want the cylinders keyframes in frame 58. Okay, hide this lattice object and show the other one. With this one, we're gonna create a bit of a squash effect. Add another lattice modifier, but choose this other lattice object. And now in edit mode, enable X-ray mode. And let's select all these vertices, move them down. Now select all these vertices and scale them up a bit. Select this and scale up a bit. And now select these vertices and I'm gonna move them down a bit more. Scale these bottom vertices. And now back to this, scale them a bit, and I will scale this until the scoop of ice cream looks chubby. Make sure the shape doesn't look too wonky, and continue moving the vertices until you're happy with the shape. Now let's animate this lattice modifier. In frame 57, take the strain to 1 and set a keyframe. And in frame 60, let's set the strain to 0 and set a keyframe so it's back to normal. Let's see. Now add another lattice modifier to all the other objects like we did a couple of minutes ago. Choose this lattice object. In frame 57, set a keyframe, and in frame 60, set the strain to 0 and set a keyframe. Now select the cheeks, add the lattice modifier, choose the lattice object. In frame 60, take the strain to 0 and set a keyframe, and in frame 57, take the strain to 1 and set a keyframe. And let's repeat. Select the eyes, add the lattice modifier, choose your lattice object, set a keyframe, and in frame 60, take the strain to 0 and set a keyframe. Now for the tongue, add a lattice modifier, set the lattice object, take the strain to 0, set a keyframe, and in frame 57, take the strain to 1 and set a keyframe. And one last time for the teeth. add a lattice modifier. Set the lattice object. In frame 57, set a keyframe, and in frame 60, set the strain to 0 and set a keyframe. Let's see. Okay, I am not 100% happy with the squash animation, so I'm gonna go into the animation workspace since we have both camera view and the viewport. And I'm just gonna move some vertices until I am happy with the shape. Make sure the mesh doesn't get through the cone. Let's move these vertices down. And now move this up a bit. And scale this one down. And let's see. Okay, just to make sure you are on the right track, let's see the keyframes for each lattice modifier. First, I'm gonna select the ice cream and move the first lattice modifier's keyframes to frame 48, so the ice cream moves a bit sooner than all the other meshes. So in frame 48, the strength is set to 0, then in frame 51, we've got a keyframe with the strength set to 1, and in frame 55, the strength is set to 0. Now let's see the first lattice modifier, but in all the other meshes. In frame 50, the strength is set to 0, then in frame 53, the strength is set to 1, and in frame 57, the strength is set to 0. And the other meshes keyframes are in the same place. Now the second lattice modifier, which is the bounce effect. Frame 57, strength to 1, and in frame 60, the strength is set to 0. And for all the other meshes, it's the same values and keyframes. And now we can finish animating the ice cream. Select the armature and in pose mode, select the bone 005. In frame 70, set a location keyframe for the x-axis, and in frame 90, move to the right on the x-axis and set a keyframe. Let's check it out. And now back to object mode, let's save this project. And finally, I'm gonna animate the mouth a bit using shape keys. So add 2 shape keys, and in edit mode, we're gonna move some vertices to create a bit of a bigger mouth, like a surprised kind of mouth. Let's move these 2 vertices to the center. Now move this one down, move this one up. Now move this one up. Let's move this to the center. Move this one down. Let's go back to object mode, and in frame 56, set the key number 1 to 1 and set a keyframe. And in frame 61, take it to 0 and set a keyframe. This is going to be a pretty subtle effect. And now we can animate the mouth again when the cone is going away. So in frame 69, set a keyframe, and in frame 77, take it to 1 and set a keyframe. And let's see. So now the ice cream gets surprised by the fact that it's going away again. If you want to, you could also play around with the interpolation and with the curves in the graph editor. I do have a few videos where I play around with the animation curves in case you want to get some ideas. And you could also create some keyframes for the teeth since they are outside the mouth in some frames. But since the animation is pretty fast, I don't think it's necessary. Okay, now I'm gonna show you my lighting setup real quick. Let's close this, and I simply added these nodes. Here I chose one of Blender's default HDRIs. If you want to know more about using a default HDRI, there's a chapter about that in this video, link in the description. Now let's see the materials. First, the simple materials. For these objects, I used a principled BSDF only. I'm gonna go one by one so you can copy the settings. For the sprinkles, I chose a pink and a green color since they are complementary colors. For the pupils, I turned the specular up, and I wanted the cheeks to be a bit shiny as well. Then we've got the tongue, For both the teeth and the eyes, I used the same white material. For the cone, I also added a color ramp node. And for the background, I added a plane and I placed it behind the ice cream. And now it's time for the plasticine look. We're gonna start by adding a displace modifier to the ice cream. For the strength, I chose 0.1 and I created a new texture. Let's go with clouds. And for the size, I chose 0.65. And for the nabla, I chose 0.02. And now add a displace modifier to the cream too. For the strength, I chose 0.2. And I used the texture we just made for the ice cream. Okay, after that, I started moving some meshes around in edit mode, since they had been covered a bit because of the displace modifier. I moved the eyes towards the front a bit, I checked them out in object mode, and I went back to edit mode to move them a bit more. Then I moved this sphere since it was floating a bit. Then I went back and forward between object and edit mode until I was happy with the placement. Then it was time for the cheeks, so let's move them a bit. And now I had to fix the mouth. Select the bases and in edit mode, I simply opened the mouth a bit more. Then I had to move the teeth a bit. And after that, I had to move the tongue as well. I went back to the mouth. And again I moved the teeth and the tongue a little bit. And then I chose to move these two vertices up so the mouth looked a bit more like a smile. And finally, I scaled the pupils down a bit. And to finish up the plasticine shader, I used all these nodes for both the scoop of ice cream and the cream. I used a fingerprint image texture, link in the description. These are my color ramp values to control the roughness. Let's connect the viewer node so you can see it. And of course, you can choose what looks better for you. Choose the mapping size according to how big or small you want the fingerprints to be. And the bigger the number in the bump node, the more notorious the fingerprints are going to be. And for the cream, first I moved some sprinkles in edit mode off camera, and I have the same notes that I just showed you, but I chose different values, so let's check them out. I used the same image texture, and you can render this project in either Eevee or Cycles. First, let's see how I rendered this in Cycles. Change the range to 95 frames. Remember to choose your output folder and name your file. I chose PNG as my format, and we don't need the alpha channel for now, so RGB it's gonna be fine. Let's go to frame 1. Because in the Cycles render, I rendered the background separately from the ice cream. First, to avoid rendering the background in every single frame, which will make a render take longer. And second, because if we render the background separately, we won't have any shadows in the background, so the image is gonna loop without having this jump between the last frame and the first frame. And I render just one image, and once the render is finished, save the image as usual. Then to render the ice cream separately, we need to make some changes. Remember to change the folder and name your file. We're gonna render as a PNG, but this time we do need the alpha channel. Now we need to enable the transparent background. The thing is that if we simply disabled the background in renders, we're gonna lose all this indirect light that the background is giving us. So what we need to do is simply select the background, and under ray visibility, let's disable camera. And this is how a render is going to look. We have all this indirect lighting on the sides, and you just simply need to hit render animation. And then of course in an editing software, I put the background image, and on top of it, I put the image sequence for the ice cream. If you wanted to render in Eevee instead, I suggest you enable all of these. You can change the settings of each property too, and you could even enable motion blur if you like. And that's it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed this one. Hopefully you'll use these techniques in your personal projects. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one. Bye!